welcome to this session. In this session, we will discuss one of the benchmark tool in determining Fed fund rate, that is the Taylor rule. So the Taylor rule is known as an activist rule, and as per this rule, the Fed fund rate is a function of inflationary gap and output gap with the appropriate weightage for these parameters. So this is what we can see here, that actually IT means the short term nominal interest rate. So in our discussion we know that this one is the Fed fund rate, which we had discussed in length in the previous sessions. Then comes the rate R star, that is the real natural long run rate of interest, that is corresponding to natural unemployment. The concept of natural unemployment and natural output we had discussed in the previous sessions. Then the rate of inflation and the target inflation rate, and this called the inflation gap, that the pi t minus pi star, that is the inflation gap. Then comes the output gap, this is called actual GDP and the potential GDP. So what, according to John Taylor, he prescribed that when a constant 2 approximates the long run average real interest rate with the target inflation rate of 2%, with the Taylor's approximation of alpha and beta is equal to 0.5, then plugging this value, this is how the Taylor's rule look like. That means weightage is 0.5 for output gap, and inflation is also 0.5. For example, suppose the current inflation is 5% with any 2% inflation target, that means the inflation gap is going to be 3%, because actual current inflation is 5%, but the monetary policy authorities, they want the policy makers, they want their target inflation is only 2%. That means there is a economy is at an inflationary pressure, that means 3% is the gap, while GDP is 1% above the potential GDP. That also says that the economy is at a boom stage, that means the current GDP is above 1% above the potential GDP, that the potential GDP means given all its resources at a time normally how much this economy can produce. So that means here GDP is 1% above, means that the factories of productions are working overtime, laborers are working instead of 8 hours they are working 12 hours or more than that, and the machines normally, suppose they normally operate for 12 hours, now they are working for 16 hours or 18 hours, like that. That means because of that the GDP is now 1% above is potential. Then according to Taylor's rule, the Fed fund rate, it should be set at, if this is the current scenario, this is how the economy's current situation, that the economy is facing inflation gap, positive inflation gap and positive GDP gap. Then accordingly, in order to cool off the economy, in order to reduce the heat, in order to cool off the economy, the Fed fund rate should be high. It should be, as per this formula, it should be 9%. That means inflation gap and the output gap of 1, and using the appropriate weightage. So in this case the FFR is equal to, it should be 9% according to Taylor's formula, Taylor's suggestion. The Taylor rule states that when the inflation goes up 1% a point above the target, the Fed should counteract the increase by raising interest rates by 1.5%. When the GDP gap rises 1%, interest rates are raised by 0.5%. So here Taylor, according to Taylor, this rule is both a pretty good rough rule and pretty close to what the Fed actually did till the 1990s. So until 1990s, actually according to him, the Fed followed almost this rule until till the 1990s. However, later on the Fed, according to Taylor, Fed actually changed from this forecast predictive tool. So here some more things I have added here just to give you an idea, always just to recollect, refresh your memory, that the nominal interest rate is real interest rate plus inflation. So by increasing nominal interest by more than the increase in inflation, Taylor's rule increases real interest rates. That means cooling off the economy when the inflation increases. The Taylor rule predicts the funds rate based on several variables. So one you can see here, inflation, target inflation rate, and assumed equilibrium rate, and GDP, right. So when Taylor proposed the 0.5 values for alpha and beta, it was based on the idea that those two policy goals should be equal. That is the dual mandate of controlling inflation and reducing unemployment. So here the dual mandate of monetary policy is that actually there are two things we need to remember. One is to control inflation. When economy is experiencing inflationary pressure, that means there is more money in the economy, that the liquidity is more in the economy. Then what Fed should do in order to counter this, if the inflation is very high, then in this case the Fed should reduce the liquidity in the economy, that the money supply available in the economy. So in order to do that, Fed should reduce the Fed fund rate. That means the rate of interest should be increased, so that when the rate of interest increases, and you know that the borrowing, the credit become very expensive, credit supply becomes very expensive, that means the rate at which, for example, member banks can borrow from the Fed, as well as for the general public, for the consumers and for the producers, when the economy's interest rate is very high, it will become a costly proposition for them to borrow from the bank and the market, right. So that means as a result the money supply will come down in the economy. That means there will be reverse flow of money supply, that from the banking system, from the general public to the banking system, and the banking system to the Fed. And overall what we see mostly more important is that when the money supply with the liquidity with the general public should go down at this time when there is an inflation. So that means less money supply will should come down when interest rate is increased. Then as a result the expected line of change is that inflation will go down. The second tool, the mandate, is increasing GDP. That means increasing GDP. It also say that reducing unemployment. That means increasing the GDP means increasing the level of economic activity. So if that is the mandate, if they give importance to GDP, increase in GDP. So when in order to increase GDP, the rate of interest should be reduced. That means the Fed fund rate should be reduced. When the Fed fund rate is reduced, that the rate of interest, the other rate of interest also get a decline, and as a result, you know that borrowing, the cost of borrowing, the cost of loanable fund become cheaper. Then it will become cheaper, cost of borrowing will become cheaper, credit supply will become cheaper. Then as a result the investment made by firms will increase, firms investment, that the investment by firms, and as well as the expenditure by the consumption by households, consumers, both will increase, and as a result there will be the economic activity will be rejuvenated, and as a result there will be increase in GDP. Then also there will be increase in a decline in unemployment, that is nothing but increasing employment. Then you know that increasing employment, then overall the per capita income will increase, then the level of standard of living of the people will increase. So these are the two things. So but the thing is that we have seen that if our objective is to increase GDP, the rate of interest should be reduced, and if our objective is to counter inflation, then the rate of interest should be increased. So here is a dual mandate, actually both are contrasting one. If they try to if they focus more on controlling inflation, then they have to increase rate of interest. That means increase rate of interest as an opportunity cost of decline, in that the cost of borrowing will increase, GDP will decline. On the other hand, if they focus on GDP, that GDP means also reducing unemployment, then they will reduce rate of interest. But then when reducing rate of interest, the liquidity, that the money supply in the economy will increase, that would lead to inflation. So, here these two are both are actually there is a trade off in fact if they target on inflation or in GDP. So, accordingly Taylor proposed that giving equal importance to both, that is the dual mandate of controlling inflation and reducing unemployment, that the equal weightage, that is 0.5 for alpha and beta. When alpha and beta are large, that means the monetary policy rules dictate aggressive response to excessive inflation and to economic booms. So, that means high Fed fund rate. High Fed fund rate means actually nothing but increasing the rate of interest. That means we can call it as contractionary monetary policy. That means tightening monetary policy. On the other hand, if alpha is greater than beta, that means monetary authority will respond much more aggressively to inflation than to the level of economic activity. That means giving more weightage, that alpha giving more weightage to inflation fighting, more aggressively to inflation. If beta is equal to 0, that means pure inflation targeting, that means the monetary policy is purely giving importance to alpha, that means inflation, no importance to, no targeting on output at all. So, that means pure inflation targeting when beta is equal to 0. So, Fed is manipulating interest rate to stabilize output around potential, not simply to increase output. So, the question here is that is 0.5 accurate? So, it's a debating issue. So, when these alphas are not 0.5, then federal chairs, the chairman of Fed are depicted as being either dovish or hawkish. So, what we see here is that based on the inflation gap, you may wonder how are we getting this coefficient. The idea here is that look at the Fed fund rate already determined, and then look at the inflation gap and also the output gap. Then accordingly after that when you plug these values, then you will come to know what is the alpha and beta, and at that time where they are giving more importance, whether to alpha or to beta. So, when based on this value, suppose it is not 0.5, if they are giving 0.5 greater than 0.5 or less than 0.5 for example for alpha or beta, then the federal chair are being depicted as being either dovish or hawkish. So, when federal funds rate is above the Taylor rule rate, what are the Taylor rule rate predict? Suppose using all this formula, Taylor rule formula, suppose using all this formula we are getting, for example 5% is as per Taylor rule. But if the actual Fed fund rate, this is as per the formula we are getting 5%. But the actual Fed fund rate, the target rate fixed by Fed is for example 6%, then we know that actually the Fed fund rate is above the Taylor rule rate. Then in this scenario, that means they are increasing interest rate in the economy, Fed fund rate, that means this is a contractionary monetary policy, and in this case we can call that the Fed chair is being more hawkish. More hawkish means they are following a tight monetary policy. That means reducing the liquidity in the economy, money supply in the economy by increasing Fed fund rate. They are actually fighting more against the inflation. You know that when the Fed fund rate increase, interest rate increase, the cost of borrowing for the firms become expensive, and then the GDP will come down. There will be decline in GDP and unemployment, right? So, that means when the Fed is following a hawkish, the Fed chair is becoming hawkish. When Fed fund rate is below the Taylor rule, for example 5 we are getting through Fed fund rate, that a Taylor rule, but when suppose then the Fed is determining the Fed fund rate at 4%, then we can call that the Fed chair, the Fed is following, they are being dovish, that means they are more following generous, more expansionary monetary policy by reducing rate of interest. Then as a result, rate of interest decline, then investment in by firms will increase, GDP will increase. So how hawkish or dovish Fed chairs are? So a chair being a dove, we mean that they care more about unemployment rates, more about economic activity and GDP rather than inflation. Then they will become, we can call them dove, or being dovish at that time. So being dovish would then be not raising interest rates quickly or enough in order to promote lower unemployment rates. Here the Jerome Powell, the current chair of Fed since 2018. So based on this these two screenshots, you can see that what former US president was accusing, saying about the chair Jerome Powell, is that he is saying that he is in a way hawkish. That means hawkish when you care more about inflation than unemployment. So here you can read it clearly that United States shouldn't be penalized because we are doing well. So because here when the economic activity is well, then as a result what the chair has done is they followed a contractionary monetary policy, that means increasing the Fed fund rate, right. So because of that, that the investment in the country, the investment by firms, that is purchasing machines and tools and setting up factory, that will come down. So that means this is actually president is accusing the Fed chair as being more hawkish. So that means when you raise interest rates quickly to fight inflation. So the opportunity cost here is the decline in investment activities, the economic activities in the economy. So I would suggest you watch a video that is put by John Taylor, his own video, that he is explaining what is Taylor rule. Is nearly 2-3 minutes video. Is available in YouTube. You will get a more idea, more insight what does it mean by the Taylor rule. Then comes about the Taylor rule. It attracted lots of criticism as well. One of the sharp critics of Taylor rule was Ben Bernanke. He was the Fed chair of 2006 to 2014. And not only that, Ben is a great academician and researcher who did lots of research, especially on 1929 the Great Depression. So as a chair, what his arguments on Taylor rule. First, he said that actually, also you read his article titled this one, Taylor rule, a benchmark for monetary policy. Just this is freely available on the web. If you just type this one and you will get this article. So Taylor rule, I'm just giving you reproducing the Taylor rule basics here. His point is that the original Taylor rule predicts that FOMC will raise Fed fund rate. That means increasing the Fed fund rate is nothing but tightening monetary policy by 1/2 percentage point. So for each percentage point that inflation rises relative to Fed's target, assumed to be 2%, and for each percentage point that that output rises relative to its potential. So Ben in his article states that Taylor rule is a simple equation, essentially a rule of thumb that is intended to describe the interest rate decisions of the Federal Reserve's FOMC. So according to Ben, here he clearly states that Taylor rule is a valuable descriptive device because it brings all the complicated aspects in an economy into a simple formula and make it as a more valuable descriptive device. However, what Ben argued that John has argued that his rule should be prescribed as well as described. That is, he believes that it should be a benchmark for monetary policy. that actually Ben object to this because originally John Taylor proposed it as a prescriptive tool, but later on John Taylor argued that it should be initially he put forward it as a descriptive tool. Later on John Taylor asked for making it as a prescriptive tool. So, according to Ben, John Taylor has been quite critical of Fed policies of the past dozen years or so. So, he also stated that Taylor's changing stance from descriptive to prescriptive. So, in 1993 when the original article was published of John Taylor's was published, it was mostly a descriptive tool. It was very helpful to understand the complex nature of monetary policy by this tool. It made things much easier. However, later on John Taylor, according to Ben, he began to make this tool not only just a descriptive, also as a prescriptive tool. That means arguing that Fed should follow this rule while setting Fed fund rate, while formulating monetary policy. So, Ben in his 1993 article, so he took pains to point out that a simple mechanical rule couldn't consider the many factors that policymakers must consider in practice. So, it was sensible, but later on argued for making his rule as a benchmark or make it as an activist rule for monetary policy. So, what Taylor argued that policy should hew closely to the Taylor rule or a similar rule virtually all the time, and that even relatively small deviation from the rule can have enormous cost. This is what Taylor's argument, Taylor is suggesting, but Ben is saying such rules couldn't incorporate all the relevant considerations for making policy in a complex dynamic economy, as the economy is very complex and is very dynamic as well. And according to Ben, just following that relying on one particular rule, that means the Taylor's rule, making it as an activist rule, it couldn't incorporate all the relevant considerations. So, monetary policy should be systematic according to Ben. That means based on the all available information, and it should be more dynamic, not automatic, not programmed, just following the not by just following the Taylor's rule. Instead, it should be more systematic. So, his argument is that I don't think we will be replacing FOMC with robots anytime soon. That means his point is that it's not it's not ideal to follow any particular just a formula for implementing the monetary policy. So, his various arguments against the Taylor rule is that one is measuring output gap is difficult because Taylor rule assumes that policymakers know and can agree on the size of the output gap. In fact, as current debates about the amount of slack in the labor market attest, measuring the output gap is very difficult, and FOMC members typically have different judgments. So, it would be neither feasible nor desirable to try to force the FOMC to agree on the size of the output gap at a point in time. So, importantly, we have seen that the Taylor rule, one of the key variable it takes into account is the output gap. So, what is output gap? This is actually the output gap. So, that means based on the output gap, this is a trend in fact based on the actual output. Suppose this particular point of time, so this is the output. So, based on the past data, and then we will be making a linear forecast, then this is going to be the natural output or potential output or potential GDP. So, this is actually if in the normal time, if all the resources are utilized in the economy, then this is going to be the potential natural output, right. So, this is, you can see this is the trend in fact. So, this is what we are talking about, the potential the gap between, for example, at a point of time, suppose this point of time in a particular year, for example, take this for example 1970, just for example. So, you can see that this is the peak. So, that the actual GDP is much greater than the trend, that the potential GDP. So this gap, we are going to say that this gap, this is the output gap. This gap is actually showing that economy is at a peak. That means this is called boom, or the economy is at very hot. That means there is peak, all the resources are working overtime, maybe due to there is a huge demand from different sectors of the economy. Then as a result, laborers are working overtime, factories are working more than the stipulated time. So that means the economic current GDP is greater than its potential GDP. So this is the gap. In another instances, you can see here the actual GDP is this one, that means below the potential GDP. So you can see that this is the negative gap. Here is a positive gap, right? So this one, I just gave you the definition here. This is the output gap, that means actual output minus potential output. So here the question what Ben was raising was that to measure the potential GDP at a particular point of time, suppose monetary policy is being designed at this point of time, this on a particular date. So at this particular point, how do we know this is the potential GDP? Actual GDP we can get, that also will take some time, right? If the GDP for this today's is, you will be getting it after 1 month, 2 months or 3 months after a period of time. So it will take time. Similarly, potential GDP also, this is not the correct estimate, this is a projection. Maybe after that they will linearize it and there will be some delay. So this actually measurement is problematic, is something erroneous as well. So that actually Ben is arguing that that variable has its own problems. Then another thing is that fixed equilibrium Fed fund rate. The Taylor rule also assumes that equilibrium Fed fund rate is fixed at 2% in real terms. So in principle, if that equilibrium rate were to change, then Taylor rule projections would have to be adjusted. So both FOMC participants and market apparently see the equilibrium funds rate as lower than standard Taylor rule assumes. So but again, there is plenty of disagreement, and forcing the FOMC to agree on one value would risk closing of important debates. So Ben, what he is saying that it's important to consider how policy responds quantitatively to changes in inflation and output gap. The original Taylor rule assumed that funds rate responds by 0.5 percentage point to 1 percentage point change in either inflation or output gap. In principle, the relative weights on the output gap and inflation should depend on, among other things, the extent to which policymakers are willing to accept greater variability in inflation in exchange for greater stability in output, because you know that there is a trade-off between inflation and output. So it also depends on the policymakers' willingness to accept the trade-off, the variability in the trade-off. No, so in that way, we cannot blindly simply follow the Taylor rule according to Ben. So there are other considerations. That is, one is third one is when the predictive rate is negative. When Taylor rule provides no guidance about what to do when the predicted rate is negative. Suppose by plugging all the value, then when you get the Fed fund rate is negative, that means when the Fed fund rate is negative means when one bank is borrowing from the other, instead of paying interest, the borrowing bank will be getting interest from the lending bank. So that also won't work in the real world, especially in the US context. So here you know that this also no guidance, clear guidance is given. Also about the zero bound problem. So during crisis time, the Fed often reduce the Fed fund rate and even make it 0 to 0.25. It was 2 years before and almost 1 year before Fed did it. So based on inflation and the output gap, there is no agreement on what the Taylor rule weights on inflation and output gap should be among the policy makers and other academicians. So the optimal weight would respond not only to changes in preference of policy makers, but also to change in the structure of the economy and the channels of policy transmission mechanism. So one more thing before I conclude this session, Taylor used GDP deflator to measure inflation, but these days personal consumption expenditure is now widely used measure to measure as a measure of inflation. So, I would suggest these are the reading materials for you to get more idea about what is Taylor rule and what are the counter argument against Taylor rule. So, let me stop here. Thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you.